Lesson 2. Importing and exporting components. Alright everyone, welcome to today's lesson. We're going to talk about one of the most powerful ideas in React, importing and exporting components. This concept is what makes React so modular and scalable. Once you understand this well, you'll be able to structure your projects neatly, reuse code easily, and collaborate better with others. 1. The root component file. Let's start with the big picture. In React, components are the building blocks of your application. Every interface you see is composed of components, and often, those components are made of other smaller components. But as your project grows, putting everything in one file becomes messy and hard to maintain. That's why we split components into multiple files. Doing this helps us keep our code organized and allows us to reuse components across different parts of our app. Now, let's talk about the root component file. This is the file where your React app begins, usually named app.js. In small projects, you might define multiple components in that file. For example, imagine you have a profile component showing a picture and a gallery component that displays several profiles. Both could live in app.js, and that works fine at first. But as your app evolves, you'll want to move those components into their own files. This makes them more modular and easier to manage. 2. Exporting and importing a component. So, how do we move components into their own files? There are 3 simple steps. Create a new file for your component. Export the component from that file. Import it wherever you need to use it. For example, suppose we move our gallery and profile components into a new file called gallery.js. Inside that file, we can export one of them, usually with a default export. Then in our main app.js, we can import that component and use it. This structure helps separate concerns. Each file has a clear purpose. App.js acts as the entry point, while gallery.js focuses on rendering the gallery itself. 3. Default versus named exports. When we talk about exports, we have 2 main types: default exports and named exports. A default export means that the file exports one primary thing, one component or one function. When you import it, you can name it whatever you like. A named export, on the other hand, is used when you want to export several components or functions from the same file. In that case, each exported item keeps its name, and when you import it, you must use curly braces. Here's how to think about it. Use a default export when your file has a single main component. Use named exports when your file defines several related components or utilities. Let's say our file gallery.js exports 2 components, one called gallery and one called profile. You can only have one default export per file, so you might export gallery as the default and profile as a named export. Then, in your app.js, you'd import both, one as a default import, the other as a named import with curly braces. This pattern gives you flexibility. You can use gallery when you want a collection of profiles, or just import profile when you need to display one person's image. 4. Exporting and importing multiple components from the same file. A good practice to remember: try to keep your files focused. If you notice that a file is exporting too many things, it's probably time to split it further. For example, you might move profile into its own file called profile.js. This makes it clear where to find each component, and it keeps your structure intuitive. Sometimes, however, it's perfectly fine to export multiple related components from the same file, for instance, gallery and profile if they logically belong together. Just remember that you can mix one default export with several named exports, as long as you use the correct import syntax. Also, note that sometimes you'll see imports without the JS extension, like import gallery from gallery. React can handle that automatically, but adding the extension is closer to the official ECMA script standard, so it's considered cleaner and more explicit. 5. Splitting components into multiple files. Now let's talk about splitting components into multiple files, which is one of the most important habits to develop as your React projects grow. So far, we've seen how to create and export components from a single file, but when too many components live together, your file can quickly become hard to read and maintain. Splitting components into their own files makes your code cleaner, easier to navigate, and more reusable. Let's take an example. We have a profile component that displays a scientist's image, and a gallery component that shows several profiles. Until now, they might have been in the same file. But now we're going to move profile into its own file, called profile.js. In profile.js, we simply define the component and export it as the default export. This means that profile.js's main purpose is to define and share the profile component. Then, in gallery.js, we import profile from the new file. Inside the gallery component, we can use the profile component as many times as we need, for example, to display 3 different profiles. Finally, we export gallery as the default export of that file. Now, in app.js, which acts as the root component, we import both gallery and profile. Then, in the render function, we display them one after another, first the gallery with multiple profiles, and then a single standalone profile. Notice how clear the structure becomes. Profile.js is responsible for one thing, the profile component. Gallery.js manages the layout of multiple profiles. App.js brings everything together as the main entry point of the application. This separation makes it much easier to maintain your code. If you ever need to change how the profile image looks, you only touch profile.js. If you want to modify how the gallery is arranged, you go to gallery.js. Each file now has a single, focused responsibility, and that's one of the keys to clean, scalable React development. 6. Recap and challenge. Let's review what we've covered. You learned what the root component file is and why it's important. You learned how to import and export components. You now understand when to use default exports and when to use named exports. You saw how to manage multiple exports from a single file. And you learned how to split large components into separate files to make your codebase easier to maintain. Finally, I want to leave you with a small challenge. Take a project where you have multiple components in one file. Try moving each one into its own file, experiment with both default and named exports, and see how it feels. Notice how much cleaner your code becomes once you start organizing it this way. That's the beauty of modular React. It's not just about writing code that works, but about writing code that scales elegantly.